Tonight is a reread of the book Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. And so I've got, I want to thank, I'm glad George is here. He missed the first longer discussion because he was out doing justice work the night of that book discussion. But I want to thank George because George is instrumental in giving me background material for tonight. As I was reading and preparing for our book discussions, I had the opportunity to talk with George, and he shared information about a calendar from the Equal Justice Initiative, which is the organization founded by Brian Stevenson. And I'm going to stop there, realizing I've sort of jumped into the book discussion without taking care of meeting logistics. My brain is like focused on books, not on Zoom. So Amy is with us tonight. She's going to be monitoring participants and letting people into the room if there are any latecomers. She's going to be helping me monitor chat. So feel free, if you want to share your comments in chat, you may type them and we will repeat them. If you want, we're a small enough group, you may certainly unmute yourself and simply talk into the group. I know that that's not really the most appropriate Zoom behavior, but we're a small group. Penny, you've shared your screen. You might not, there you go, Penny. But we're a small group, and if someone talks over someone else, I think we can probably negotiate the who gets to talk first. There is at the bottom, if you're on a regular computer, at the bottom there is an ability to raise your hand, not physically necessarily, though Amy and I'll be monitoring the screen to see if people do that. But a little yellow hand will show up. Hey, Penny, good to see you. And so feel free to jump in with your comments. This is the reread of the longer book discussion. We'll still try to end about 7:15 to make sure that if people have other things they need to do tonight, either at church or in your real life, that's okay. So, so back to George and his reference and sharing this calendar. And the calendar for every entry of every day, 365 days a year, highlights some injustice in our nation's history. And the thing that struck me as very overwhelming in this, that calendar, this is not the first time it's been produced by the Equal Justice Initiative. But rather this has been an ongoing activity that they use for a fundraiser, which just simply speaks to the depth of injustice and the number of incidents that have happened throughout our history, that there are so many acts of discrimination, so many acts of violence that you can have the same day 2 or 3 or 4 or many times, what is sad is you don't run out of examples. So I thought I would share the actual entry for today, March 24th, which reads, on this day in 1832, Creek Indians signed the Treaty of Cuseta with the United States, under which they were stripped of land in Alabama. They were forcibly removed from the state by 1837. So what occurred on this day nearly 2 centuries ago, we can understand today as part of a systematic plan authorized by Congress in what was known and was called the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which included the forced migration of over 125,000 indigenous people. And when I sort of had to think about that number, I mean, that's the size of a major city. And when you think about it in terms of the population of our country 200 years ago, that is it was then and it still is today, a significant number of people who were forcibly removed from the southeastern states and moved to what was then considered unwanted land in west of the Mississippi. And so we know from having read the book that those kinds of injustices are built into our system and continue to today. But lest we focus on the negative, because I don't get the sense as I read the book that Bryan Stevenson ever, succumbs to that it is unachievable. I will use some words that he offered, which is, and I'll use those as the chalice lighting. I've come to believe that the true measure of our commitment to justice, the character of our society, our commitment to the rule of law, fairness, and equality cannot be treated by how we treat the rich, the powerful, the privileged, and the respected among us. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. It is necessary to recognize that we all need mercy, we all need justice, and perhaps we all need some measure of unmerited grace. So, and I realize we'll see how good I am at trying to light the chalice. So we have our chalice to bring us together. So what we found useful in the other book discussions is that we leave a little bit of time at the end, because the books we've been reading are just so full of marvelous phrases, great, meaningful written dialogue that sort of clutches at your heart. So if you have your copy with you and you want to page through to some of those places that you have marked, as we get close to the end of our discussion, maybe 7:05, 7:10, we'll certainly let people read your favorite passage from the book to share, just what phrases, what paragraphs really touched your soul. So be thinking about that, so you have an assignment between now and the next half hour. As far as book discussion questions, after working with low-income and incarcerated people for many years, Stevenson came to believe the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. So as you read or watched the movie of Just Mercy, how did you see poverty affecting the lives that he wrote about in Just Mercy?
To me, it was a common thread. Don't.
You're already on.
Okay. I said you're getting a bunch of silence here for an answer. And
Well,
I have read the book and watched the movie, but it's been a while ago, so I'm not able to answer for you.
Well, Penny, don't worry. One of the things we have to do with this Zoom is we have to allow plenty of time for the internet to do its thing. Okay. And the other thing that I've found is, now this is the fourth book discussion I've done on these topics. These are well-written books, but they're tough books on tough topics.
Mhm.
And sometimes the questions are sort of like, well, just how do I answer that? So don't worry, Penny. Is the question easier if I rephrase it and ask, just how did race affect the lives and the decisions that were made with regards to incarceration and our justice system as portrayed in the book by Bryan Stevenson?
So those both seem to be confounding or compounding issues. They don't. I don't think they're additive. They sort of multiply each other. Certainly, from Stevenson's book, race is an overwhelming factor. I think from most of what most of us know about policing and the justice system, or what we've come to realize, is that race is a critical issue. Poverty, I don't know that I look at poverty as the opposite of poverty being justice, but certainly the opposite of poverty, in my view, is power. So without power, without the ability to gather resources in one's defense and one's it ends up being a part of injustice. But I don't know that it's that I think of it as poverty and justice as opposite poles.
Poverty really permeates the book. Race isn't the only factor, it's a predominant factor in this book. I mean, some of the people that Brian talked about were white people, not many of them, but most of the people who were on death row were Black people. And poverty resulted in really an inability to get legal representation, an inability to affect the system that they would face once they got into the system. For example, you couldn't get a Black jury because Black juries were based upon the voting rolls, and the voting rolls were, jiggered because of voter suppression and other factors. And in order to change all those things, you need resources to lobby the legislature, change the laws, whatever. And so when you're in poverty, you're just powerless. You don't even know some of the barriers that you face until you're in the system and find out. You're telling me I can't get a jury of my peers? Why is that? Well, that's because the way the system's set up, you're just powerless to affect it. If you're not in poverty and you get charged with something, you have the ability to hire somebody to argue these points, challenge these points, maybe figure out other things. But I mean, so many of these people that we encountered in the book, they just got into the system and they sat in prison for months. Nobody even approached them. Bryan Stevenson was lucky to reach out to a few of them. But what about all the other people that he never even contacted? They're just kind of lost in the system, unfortunately. And it makes you wonder how many people in the system. I'm sure that, it's not the case that 100% of the people who are in prison were innocent, but I mean, I think we can tell that a lot of people got railroaded in, they didn't do it, or what they got charged with was way above what they should have been charged with. Because of their poverty situation, they were powerless to affect the system once they got wrapped up in it.
You mentioned getting a jury of your peers. A different book that I'm reading now is set in 1915, I think it is. And in order to be on the jury, you had to be able to vote. And at that time, women could not vote. So they couldn't serve on juries.
Maybe that's where, if you go out under the poverty, then you go back, you get down to justice, because poverty, because of a lack of equality, what's just a minute, I'm just spacing on the word, equitable. Because of the laws, which gets us to justice, that you are locked in poverty because of justice. So maybe the opposite of wealth is justice. I'm just thinking that the justice part was prohibited by the laws and caused and maintained poverty. They couldn't move out. The people who came back from World War II that were Black didn't get the money, to get the homes, and there's so many reasons, but that's getting down to justice and the law and laws that prevented them to move up and have equitable jobs, equitable.
Well, and certainly from my position, I've always equated the law and justice on an equal plane. But I think what, just even looking at the Indian Removal Act of 1830, it was a law, but it did not make it justice.
Right.
Definitely not equal. And certainly as laws have been put into place that were and currently are in place, with where it's gerrymandering districts or whether it's redlining, on a whole host of things that continue to keep voter rolls exclusive to those in privilege to continue the cycle. I mean, Richard and I were having this discussion today, why shouldn't Washington, D.C. be a state? Well, the Republicans don't want it because there's no car dealership in Washington, D.C. This doesn't necessarily equate to statehood in my mind, but it puts the possibility, a strong possibility, of 2 senators from the District of Columbia and a representative. And not necessarily is it a given, but it's probably a fairly strong supposition that the person will be of a person of color, and or at least someone of a more liberal persuasion. So, I think I have to keep reminding myself that it isn't, justice and law does not necessarily equate in the treatment of human beings.
And I agree with what you and I think Penny and Kathy said. Just because things went to the legal system doesn't mean justice was served. I mean, if you look at Walter's case, and I think other cases in the book, and like Penny, I read this 3 months ago, so I'm kind of trying to draw back. But in some of the court proceedings, the witnesses that resulted in the conviction were lying, and the attorneys showed that they were lying once and twice and 3 times. And so justice was not served in those court proceedings. I mean, they went through the motions of the legal process, but they just totally ignored the facts and the evidence and the testimony of reputable people and decided to give weight to testimony that was demonstrably false, that was lies. So justice was not served. So the law and justice were not equal, what we saw in this book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had planned to just sit and listen to the discussion.
Oh, George, that is never the case. Jump in there.
But it's very, very interesting when we talk about law and justice. People who make the laws can make them however they want. And then they can make them to discriminate against you, and there's not a lot you can do because you don't have the power. It's about power. And Elizabeth Katzman is here, and she keeps popping stuff on the Facebook, and I'm a little afraid to get on Facebook, but she consistently shows very interesting comparisons about the truth and justice and so forth. But at any rate, this is a delightful conversation, and I will be quiet and listen a bit more. Although the next day, the 25th rather, Paola Lazozo, a white woman from Detroit, Michigan, is shot and killed while driving. And I believe she was a Unitarian, but I'm not sure. I think I heard that a long time ago. And I just thought, boy, oh boy. So yeah, I would recommend, if you really want to understand and appreciate things, you get one of these.
They're very inexpensive. They're $6. I'm like, how can they even print these and make any money?
Right.
And there was no postage. I was
Where
like,
do you get
okay.
them?
So
Where do
I'm
you-
gonna send, I'll send, maybe they're
Justice Initiative.
maybe their lost leader is that they send this to me for $6 and don't charge me postage. And then I wrote them a bigger check.
That works.
you-
That works.
You
Yeah.
can access the calendar through the their website.
Oh,
you can
wow.
get-
We'll find the
you can get-
website and put it in the chat.
You can get it as a daily posting. Because it comes to my individual email on a daily basis. And I hate to say this, but I don't need another calendar in my home.
Well, I would have to agree with you too, Elizabeth, except when George told me about this, I was like, oh my goodness, I need this. I need this. I need this as the book discussion leader. And oh, by the way, who knows, some of these dates might show up in a worship associate call to worship.
Mhm.
They're as late as last year, so, I mean, it's got,
Yeah.
it's in it from last year.
So in the discussion, when Brian is visiting Walter's family, which were very emotional scenes, they explain the toll Walter's incarceration took on the community. The exact quote from one of his family members was, "We feel they put us on death row too." So, have you had a chance to think about incarceration and the ramifications of incarceration, not just on the individual who has been found guilty, but on the repercussions throughout an extended family?
So the book, The New Jim Crow, really focuses on a lot of the ramifications of that. There's a huge segment of the Black male population that's been incarcerated and has lost certain rights in society, and that has implications for their family, for their ability to get jobs and public support. And it has been incredibly disruptive and just tearing apart a lot of the social fabric of poorer Black society.
Absolutely.
Takes the father figure out of the home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a huge ripple effect.
So
Go ahead.
I was going to change the subject and go back to the previous question. So Kathy, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I was just going to go, I mean, I think Ann said, I think in the community, they often know it wasn't, they're not guilty. So not only they are helpless because they're being held as if they're guilty. They have no representation. They can't access that because of the poverty. And the community knows they weren't guilty. In many cases, I mean, not, there's always an exception but how helpless that feels when even as a whole group, you can't facilitate any change. You can't, I just can't imagine.
Well, speaking of the inability to affect change, does anybody know where the origin of banning felons from voting came from? I can't imagine why we would do that any individual should have a say in society, no matter what they've done or where they've been.
I read Heather Cox Richardson. I don't know if any of you read her daily writings, but she explained that in one of her things, and I can't remember what she said. Why did I even mention it now then? But I know that she explained where it came from, but it was another thing to limit the vote. Yeah, to profile the vote.
it's a part of the punishment, isn't it? Losing your right to vote would be part of punishments.
But you're already punished by being in prison. I
Yeah.
mean,
It was beyond that. I think it had racial underminings. Maybe Elizabeth can find it there on Google.
I'm looking. I'm not fast though, so just
I have a website
talk
here that
among
I'll post in the
yourselves.
chat.
Okay.
I have what my family calls Google Foo Power.
I'll mute myself and
So I think it ripples beyond the family and it goes out to the whole community. I was actually surprised that in Walter's case that they actually, that the prosecutors were at the end actually somewhat reasonable, because I had listened for a couple of years to the In the Dark podcast. I think I've mentioned that here before, from NPR, where somebody was tried 6 times for the same crime, Winona, Mississippi, and the entire community was lined up, black versus white. It wasn't just the family. And, his mother drove, long distances every week to see him. She died before he was let out of prison. But then he can't go back to Winona because the white people want to kill him because they still think he's guilty. It's insane. Even though he was obviously innocent. I just can't believe we still live in a culture where the color of your skin matters at all. Not to say this much.
Did you see?
Here it says that it happened. Black disenfranchisement started happening in the middle.
This is from Wikipedia, and we know it's got to be true, but maybe in this case it is. Many states adopted felon voting bans in the 1860s and 1870s, at the same time that voting rights for Black citizens were being considered and contested. Scholars have linked the origins and intents of many state felon voting bans to racial discrimination. In some states, legislators have been accused of specifically tailoring felon voting bans to purposefully and disproportionately target African Americans, for example, by targeting minor crimes more common among these citizens, while allowing felons who committed more serious crimes such as murder to vote.
that's something along the line of what I remembered,
Mhm.
that there was this huge discrimination again.
So Amy, do you want to let us to share what you've added in chat?
Yes, sorry, I had a phone call come in from the school, so it was nothing important, so. Too many things going on here. I'll turn my camera on since I'm talking. So in the chat, I've shared the information about the Equal Justice Initiative. I've also shared the history of felon enfranchisement. And then In the Dark was what David Kalmus had mentioned, and it's specifically season 2 with Curtis Flowers. And it's a really interesting thing because in season 3, the investigative reporter actually continues contact with people, and I can't remember, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's Mississippi, where she stays in contact with the people she built relationships with Curtis Flowers during COVID times, because they kind of dovetailed. So that goes on to season 3. And then I said season 1 is about Jacob Wetterling, for what it's worth, for those of us who are familiar with that.
In his case, went to the Supreme Court and they overturned his conviction, or it's amazing.
So can I go back to your first question for a moment, Ann?
Sure.
And there was some discussion about justice versus the law and how those are not always congruent. What really struck me about the book, though, was how what was really the relationship between justice and the enforcement of the law, which was a much more critical factor in this book, how so much is left to the personal discretion of law enforcement, of prosecutors, and of judges. And we tend, as youth, we sort of are told justice is blind. We revere justices, and that whole part of our government, and there's so much personal leeway within those systems. And when we realize, and we're starting to realize more and more, how many people in those systems are not the kind of people that we want to sit around a table with. There are just too many bigots populating those populations, and the discretion that is allowed, and the peer pressure on these people is what was responsible for some of the most horrific stuff in this book. I understand that there are laws that tilt the whole justice system one way or the other, but the discretion and how the law is enforced was the shocking thing to me from this book.
Another thing that struck me, you didn't ask about this, Anne, but a major theme of the book was obviously people for whom justice was miscarried. They were in prison and they should not have been in prison. But the other thing that really resonated with me was the death penalty itself. That it from afar, it can be easy for so many people to think, oh, this is a quick and easy thing, blah, blah, blah. I think Brian really pointed out in the book that executions are painful. They are cruel and unusual. So-called botched executions are probably more the run-of-the-mill executions. And so I think he made that really clear in the book about this is however you punish people who are really guilty, death penalty is a really bad thing to do.
We had and when we did the longer book discussion, we did spend some time on the death penalty.
Okay.
And understanding that we're a good group of UUs, we basically reached that same conclusion, Greg. That at what point in our world, in our society, do we assume the right? And obviously, the law gives us that right in some states, to take the life of another. And even those families of victims that advocate not to perpetuate the pain and the agony of the loss of a family member. So,
well, I would like to respond to some of that. If it were me in prison with no hope of parole, with convicted of something really major, I think I'd like to have the choice of whether I stayed in prison for the rest of my life or whether I could have a quick ending. I don't know if that's ever been discussed, but in some cases, it would seem to me that it would be the kinder thing to let the person die than to keep them year after year after year with no hope of ever living a normal life.
that's an interesting premise, Penny, but then it also then gives the opportunity of choice to the convicted. And
Yeah.
we seem, the whole concept of punishment is to take away all choice.
Well, that's true.
No,
That's true.
but I don't know that it has been discussed as an option, Penny.
I don't know. Never read about it, but I guess I'm just thinking that a future that was totally in prison would be worse than a quick ending.
I wanted to go back to what Jerry just said about prosecutors and other people, that they may be mendacious and we shouldn't respect them out of hand. They're under a lot of pressure to make arrests, to get convictions, you know, they have all this pressure on them to do that. And so maybe not in every case, but you can see where that tilts the scales too against the powerless. Of course, they're going to go after the powerless because they're weak. And if they have to get a conviction or their community's mad at them, everything's tilted against the powerless.
So we're sort of coming up on our end time for this abbreviated discussion. I did want to go back to the fact that I have two things for us to think about as we come to an end. If there were parts of the book that you had marked and wanted to share, I wanted to make sure you had a chance to voice whatever beautiful words resonated with you. The other thing is that if there are other books you think we should consider for future UU Common Reads, any titles are, Amy and I'll take them down and we can share them for possible consideration for next year's discussion. Jerry, you mentioned The New Jim Crow. Are there other books that you've been reading that we should consider?
I think you've already considered it, but I'm now reading A Good Time for the Truth. Is that one that has already been discussed?
We did that, Penny. We did the discussion in December in a long 2-hour Zoom session, and then we did a shorter Wednesday night. So yes.
I missed that one then.
Okay. And for anyone who hasn't read it, it's a marvelous set of 16 essays by Minnesota individuals of color, speaking about their own personal experiences.
Mhm.
Other titles we should consider?
And I found Waking Up White by Deborah Irving or Deb Irving.
Okay.
That one was profound for me.
I know the UU book group just finished Cast. Richard's reading it. It's on my to read list. Aha, there you go. Thank you, George.
Okay. Okay.
And so then I'll put in a plug. We're doing a reread for an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States on April 14th. So it'll be another Wednesday night forum. Roxanne Schleschner led the first book discussion group, and she's going to do the reread.
And in today's e-news, there is a link to some of the discussion questions for that reread, as well as the Dakota 38, which is a video on YouTube about, and Claire, where did it take place? The Dakota 38, Mankato?
Mankato.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Hello, Claire.
Thanks
She
for
says
the
hi.
thanks for the service, Claire.
thanks for
Great
the
job,
service.
Claire.
Great job.
Good job.
She won't let me show her or anything.
That's okay. As long as she can hear us, she knows we're sending her warm vibes because she did a fantastic, if she's still listening, you did a fantastic job, Claire. So anyone want to share, as we have a few minutes until we conclude, words of wisdom from the book?
I have a couple more books. I went and got my list.
Oh, excellent, Greg.
So one is a book I mentioned about a year ago to you, George, Gloryland by Sheldon Johnson. He's currently he's a black man. He's a park ranger at Yosemite Park, but he writes about a black man who witnessed the humiliation of his father in South Carolina in the late 1800s. After the Civil War, he witnessed a lynching. He walks west, he walks halfway across the country. He joins the army, he becomes part of the Buffalo Soldiers. So just what he faced in his life is pretty revealing. And one that relates to the indigenous people is called Killers of the Flower Moon by David Gran.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a book about, for
I'm
a while,
reading that right now.
Are you? Yeah. So for a
Say the
while, the
title.
Osage Nation in Oklahoma was like the richest part of the country because oil was discovered there. And the Osage people were smart enough to retain the mineral rights. But one by one, they got picked off by devious white attorneys who would gin their mills and whatever, or their wills. And so it's the story of what happened to the Osage people.
Repeat the title, Greg.
The title? It's called
Yeah.
Killers of the Flower Moon. And it's by an author named David Grann, Grann. And I don't know if anybody's ever read Trevor Noah, Born a Crime is a good perspective on being Black.
Yes,
So-
that's a phenomenal book.
And so is Michelle Obama's book, which is as everybody probably knows, Becoming.
Amy went to hear her speak during her book launch. I'm so jealous.
I think there's a couple others, but those are a few of the ones I've read of late.
Anything
you're in-
else for
Oh, I was going to
tonight?
say, if you're into podcasts, I highly recommend the podcast 1619. If you haven't listened to that, that was a phenomenal podcast, and it actually prompted some last day legislation by the previous administration that, of course, hasn't gone very far in the new administration. And then I have one more podcast. It's Unfinished. And then there's 2 seasons, and the one that I recommend is Deep South. And then, then one more called Uncivil. And those last 3 are all podcasts, which I have devoured last summer. They were all just very enlightening and in pieces that were easy to handle. Because I mean, as we all know, a lot of this can be kind of overwhelming at times. And so I like the podcast because I could take the time to think about what was happening, what I was hearing.
Amy, is there a way to capture what you included in the chat and email it to people?
Yep. So actually, if you go to the 3 little dots in the chat where it says file and then the 3 little dots, you can save the chat. But yes, absolutely, I can also email it out.
Okay, thank you.
I'll throw out the YouTube video with Emmanuel Acco, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. And he's just
Can you spell that, please?
Emmanuel, E-M.
Yes.
Okay. Yep.
A-U-E-L?
Acco.
A-C-H-O?
H-O.
Yeah. Look for the title, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man.
There's a whole series of them.
Yeah,
The
on
whole
YouTube.
series. He started doing it right after started producing these short, and they're like, they're not very much longer than 15, 18 minutes. And he started doing them after the George Floyd murder, and understanding that people, especially those of us white of privilege, needed to have something to try and understand this craziness. And so he was willing to sit down with people to have uncomfortable conversations, uncomfortable for him, trying to answer questions that he shouldn't have to answer, but also uncomfortable for his guests, who were like coming in oblivious. So we're getting close to our end of time.
So Amy, will you send out the chat to these participants? Because I don't see how to save it. Thank you.
Yep, I'm on it right now, so I don't forget.
Thanks.
It is so nice having someone to technically manage the behind the scenes of this discussion, so I don't have to think about that. So I'll, since we're getting to the end of the time, I'm going to close with the last paragraph of the book. So he's talked about the fact that he's gone to church and he has the fact that in the Christian religion, you're talking about the fact that, you know, only those who are without guilt should be throwing stones. And his last paragraph comes back to the stone throwers, but he refers to instead the stone catchers, the ones who are trying to stop the hurt. So this is how he ends the book. I continue to meet stone catchers along the way who inspire me and make me believe that we can do better than we've done for the accused, convicted, and condemned among us, as well as those who are victimized by crime and violence, and that all of us can do better for one another. The work continues. And so we can, you know, he continues to do the work that he has been dedicated his life to, and certainly within our church mission. And with this group of people, I know you too are also continuing to do good work to move justice forward. So thank you all for participating tonight. Continue to do good work.
Okay,
Good night.
goodbye, everybody.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
for what you
Kathy,
do.
Yeah.
what's your email address?
You're muted, Kathy.
Kathy, you're still muted.
I got it. Thank you.
Okay,
KAPCAN, Capcan,
yep,
at hotmail.com.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So in about 2 weeks, Elizabeth and I are going to be in Montgomery, Alabama. We're going to visit the Peace and Justice Initiative Summit. So we'll bring back some calendars.
Okay.
That-
I was looking
We ordered a bunch of them. We were giving them away as presents, you know, or just
Yeah, we
to-
ordered about
yeah,
20
We sent Randy Chapman one and lots of other people. So
and they're ticking them off
yeah.
every day. So wonderful education.
Yeah.
All right. Good night, everybody. Good to see you.